Now, before we go much further, I want to just take a couple of minutes to have a little think about what international law is. We read and hear consistently statements about Israel being in breach of international law. It is said that Israel is illegally occupying the so-called Palestinian territories. It's said that Israel is illegally building settlements in those territories. All the settlements built since 1967 are illegal. It is said that Israel is breaching international humanitarian law in various different ways. Israel is breaching international human rights law. The language of international law is being consistently used, and we see it time and time again in UN resolutions, we see it in the media, and we see it in the area of NGOs, and even, I think, rather concerningly, churches and church organisations stating time and again, restating these statements about Israel breaching international law. Now, I would argue that international law is neither as simplistic nor as straightforward, nor as clear as many of those statements would have us believe. The first thing we need to realise is that the UN itself is not a law-making institution. The UN does not make law. Where does international law come from? Well, international law is very different from a national legal system. International law is the law of nations. It is created by nations. And the most important way that nations create law is through treaties. Treaties are binding because they are entered into consensually. Nations consent and agree to undertaking certain obligations upon themselves, and therefore they become bound by them. They're also bound by general principles, well-accepted principles of international law. For example, that treaties are required to be complied with, that you cannot use force to achieve the existence of territories and so forth. These are clear principles of international law. Another source of international law are the general conduct of states, by which we can see that they regard themselves as being bound by a certain principle of international law. But that's only the case when all states involved regard themselves as being bound. But this very fact, for example, that a UN resolution, either a General Assembly or a Security Council resolution, states that something is illegal does not make it illegal. Statements of law in resolutions by UN bodies are not binding, they're not definitive. We need to look further. So I would encourage those who use these statements to be very careful. Now, the idea that Israel is illegally occupying the territories which it gained control of in 1967 really came about after 1973. 73, in a way, the year of the October Yom Kippur War, was the turning point, I would say, in relation to the creation of Palestinian statehood. Prior to 73, there was no accepted notion that the Palestinians had a right to statehood. Things changed after the Yom Kippur War. That was the final attempt, if you like, of the Arab nations to wipe out Israel through military means. They then turned really to the United Nations as their platform to achieve by means of international law what they'd failed to achieve through military means. And we saw a whole range of resolutions being developed, and they were being promoted and sponsored by nations like Pakistan, like Jordan, supported by Russia and the former Soviet states. Resolutions requiring Israel to give up all the territories that it took control of in 1967. And Europe at that point in time started to buy into that narrative. Prior to 73, Europe, which of course was still young as a European economic community at that time, had not taken a position. after 73, in response, I believe, to the oil embargoes and to Palestinian terrorism, took upon itself to promote the achievement of a Palestinian state next to the State of Israel. Now, as I say, prior to that, all the UN resolutions and all the accepted statements of international law had not required Palestinian statehood. The most clear statement at that time was the Security Council Resolution 242, which was from November 1967, just a couple of months after the Six-Day War of June 1967. And that was the Security Council statement which required Israel to negotiate, required Israel and its neighbouring states to negotiate, and not requiring Israel to withdraw fully to the pre-67 territories. It says quite clearly in Resolution 242 that Israel is required to withdraw its forces, some of its forces, from those territories, but not all of its presence and not all of those territories. Now, from the 73, as I say, onwards, essentially we saw the nations giving in to Palestinian terrorism and the Arab oil boycott, and Europe officially adopting the view that the Palestinians have a right to a state based on the so-called 1967 borders, which, as we will see in a moment, are not borders at all. Now, resolutions like these can never override rights and interests which have been previously granted. So a resolution from 1973, for example, 1980, or whenever, can never override rights and interests which were granted to the Jewish people under the Mandate for Palestine as far back as 1922. Under that mandate, the Jewish people acquired rights and sovereignty, arguably, to the whole area of the Mandate territory. We'll come to that in a moment. Now, another area relates to the opinions or decisions of the International Court of Justice. It's very often we see quotations taken from the 2004 opinion of the International Court of Justice on the security barrier, in which the Court of Justice said and stated that effectively Israel is illegally occupying those territories. Now, that was an opinion of the Court of Justice. It's not binding, and it's very important to understand that that opinion was very politically biased. It came about as a result of a political process in the United Nations General Assembly, and I believe the Court of Justice allowed itself to be taken to be a part of that political process. There's more to be said on that on another occasion. So I think it's important to understand that international law is rather complicated and in many respects not as clear-cut as many people would have us believe.